Kasey, I'm having a hard time hearing you now.
She's on mute. Kasey, you're on mute. Jacqueline, you're on mute also.
Kasey, we lost you.
There she is.
Okay, we're off to a rocky start, but that means things can only get better. Am I right?
There you go.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining us. Tonight's topic, MS and cannabis therapy, is presented by the Cannabis Foundation and the Shepherd Center in cooperation with MS Views and News and the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation, and is sponsored by CBD Essentials and Big Wave Enterprises. We're excited to be able to bring you this important topic, MS and cannabis therapy. So this evening will be a panel discussion. We have several panelists with us tonight. I will start with an introduction of each of our panelists, and then we will move on to some of the questions that you all have submitted during your registration process. So our speakers for this evening, our panelists are Dr. Ben Thrower and Dr. Jacqueline Rosenthal from the Shepherd Center's MS Institute, Aryn Sieber from Cannabis, and patient advocate Kristine Werner. Now let me tell you a little bit about each of these speakers. So we'll begin with Dr. Thrower. Ben Thrower is a neurologist, and he's the medical director of the Andrew C. Carlos MS Institute at Shepherd Center in Atlanta, Georgia. He's also the senior medical advisor to the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation and serves on the board of Can Do MS. He co-authored the book Navigating Life with MS for the American Academy of Neurology. He serves on the clinical faculty at Emory University and the Augusta University of Georgia Medical Partnership. Along with his pediatrician wife, Karen, they serve on the board of Comunidad Connect and provide medical care to underserved populations in rural Nicaragua. He's worked with the legislature of Georgia in providing advocacy and guidance on issues relating to the use of cannabinoids in MS. Then we have Dr. Jacqueline Rosenthal, who is also a neurologist at the Andrew C. Carlos MS Institute at Shepherd Center. She's a graduate of Morehouse School of Medicine and completed her neurology residency at Madigan Army Medical Center. She went on to complete a neuroimmunology fellowship at the Atlanta VA Medical Center and Emory MS Clinic. Also with us this evening is Kristine Werner, a patient advocate who serves the National MS Society as secretary on the Board of Trustees and chair of the Government Relations Advisory Committee. She has testified at the Georgia Capitol for 3 pieces of legislation covering step therapy, low THC oil, and also pharmaceutical benefit managers. The National MS Society recently honored her with the District Activist of the Year Award for her contributions to advocacy. And finally, last but not least, we have Aryn Sieber. Aryn developed inoperable stage 4 cancer in 2014 after volunteering at Ground Zero on 9/11. Undergoing rigorous treatments, he used his 40-plus years of cannabis experience to create a line of CBD THC tinctures and infused topicals. Surviving cancer, he launched the Cannabis Foundation and Cannasour brands and emerged as an award-winning cannabis pioneer for his farming work and topical formulations. Aryn is a cannabis therapy expert and uses the patient data collected by the Cannabis Foundation as the basis for his consultations and real-world studies. He believes everyone deserves the medicine they need. So first of all, let me say good evening to all of you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm going to pause for one more moment to see if we see Kristine in the group. Hopefully she's had an opportunity to join us. And if so, I will be able to.
I see her connecting audio.
There we go.
I think she's unmuted. Kristine?
Hi.
Yay!
Hi, Kristine.
Sorry about that.
Sorry for the trouble that you had
No.
connecting.
It's fine. Thank you. Sorry for the delay.
Oh,
All right.
made it.
So now that we're all here, let's jump right into the questions. We'll start with Dr. Ben Thrower. Dr. Ben, can you explain exactly what endocannabinoids are?
Absolutely. And thank you, Kasey, for moderating this. So many people are familiar with the term cannabinoid. And so cannabinoids are the active chemicals that we find in the cannabis plant. And so we're going to talk some this evening about CBD and THC. What some people are not aware of is that humans have an endocannabinoid system. So, you know, a lot of us are familiar with our nervous system and our cardiovascular system and our system, but we also have an endocannabinoid system. So this is a system in the human body that, if you will, has a lot. So it plays a role in pain management, in mood, in sleep, in metabolism, in immune function, mediating inflammation. And so just like there are cannabinoids or cannabinoids in plants, in cannabis, we make our own cannabinoids. And so these are called endocannabinoids. And there are two major ones. There's one called anandamide and another one called 2-AG. And the chemical structures of these chemicals we have in our body naturally are kind of similar to the cannabinoids that we see in cannabis. So what are how do these things work? Years ago, it was discovered that there are receptors in the human body for cannabinoids, for the endocannabinoids that our body makes naturally, and some of the cannabinoids that come from cannabis also work at these receptors. So there's a CB1 receptor and a CB2 receptor. CB1 is found primarily in the central nervous system, so in the brain and spinal cord. CB2 receptor found in the peripheral nerves, but more importantly, they're found on every immune cell in the human body has a CB2 receptor. We know that one of the major roles of the endocannabinoid system is to sort of serve as almost a shutoff valve for excitatory neurotransmitters. So if your nerves are firing, you're sending an electrical signal down the nerve. When the nerve ends, we call that the synapse. And so at that synapse or junction, chemical messengers are released that then will affect the next nerve to do something. What the endocannabinoids do is they're released from that downstream nerve, and they send a signal back to the upstream nerve to say, hey, shut it off. Turn the turn off valve. We're going to shut off this excitatory activity. So it's a very different way. We normally think of chemical transmitters working downstream. The endocannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG, actually work upstream. So they're like salmon swimming upstream. We're still learning how phytocannabinoids, plant-based cannabinoids, actually work. So we know that THC, for instance, binds to both CB1 and CB2 receptors. CBD is a little stranger. We don't have good evidence that CBD actually binds to either of these receptors. And it's thought that the way CBD may work is it may inhibit the enzymes that break down natural endogenous cannabinoids. So it may let those natural cannabinoids in the human body stick around longer. You know, it's interesting to think about when we think about the mechanisms of action of the system. You know, what does that mean? Dr. Rosenthal, later may speak to some of the things that she sees in the clinic with how we use these things in the real world. But we do think of these as symptom management medications that we can use. And it's interesting to think of their anti-inflammatory properties. We said that the CB2 receptors are present all inflammatory or all immune cells. Could that mean that we could use cannabinoids to treat inflammation or even modulate the long-term course of MS. It's an interesting theory. No one's been able to prove it yet. There's still a lot of research groups working on that. So I would say stay tuned. But the endocannabinoid system is something we all should be aware of, just like we're aware of our nervous system and our cardiovascular system.
Thank you for that, Dr. Thrower. Let me ask a quick follow-up question. You talked a little bit about THC and CBD. For people who aren't very familiar with cannabinoids or cannabinoids, can you please explain the difference?
Yeah, and we have to get into kind of the plants that they come from, if you will. So CBD is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid. So it doesn't have the potential to make you high. There are a host of other cannabinoids that are also non-psychoactive, but CBD would be the one that we're most familiar with. Cannabis plants tend to have about 122 different cannabinoids. So there are a lot of these cannabinoids out there other than just CBD and THC. THC is the cannabinoid that does have some psychoactive properties. So it has the potential to make people high. So hemp plants, all of these things, hemp and marijuana, are cannabis. So Cannabis sativa, one of the subspecies, is hemp. Hemp was bred over over multiple generations. It goes back thousands of years to have more of a fibrous stalk. So they were, farmers were trying to breed hemp to make paper and rope. So they wanted more of a fibrous stalk. In the process of doing that, they ended up largely taking the gene out of hemp that codes for THC. They didn't mean to do that, it just happened. So hemp plants can be rich in CBD, they make very little THC. When you get into Cannabis sativa or Cannabis indica, if you will, marijuana, those are going to still have the gene to make THC, whereas again, hemp would not.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Rosenthal, what would you like to add?
I think Dr. Thrower covered the majority of that to that particular question.
Okay. All right.
Let me just add a little bit to that, please. So also as a breeder and grower for many years, some of the things that have happened also, to Dr. Thrower's point, is when you start crossbreeding different strains, you get different levels. And so usually when the hemp farmers go in, they have to get a sampling from their field, and depending on the size of the field, they have to have multiple samplings. They get it tested, and then they have to harvest within X amount of time to be under the radar of the 0.3% THC. And as the crossbreeding happens, there are some strains that still are very high in CBD, but maybe have 4%, 5%, 10% THC. So those wouldn't qualify as a hemp plant, but we'll get into later maybe more about the way that ratios work and having higher levels of THC. So just important to know that what Dr. Ben said was right on point. And that's why you always want to check when you get a product to find out maybe what the ratios are, so you know how much THC is actually in a product.
So Aryn, isn't it true that all of the CBD products that people are buying over the counter, so these are all hemp-based products, and by law they cannot have more than 0.3% THC. Some have 0, but isn't that correct too?
Yes, exactly, and that's actually a great point, Ben. So even as such, when you'll see products that are labeled CBD, again, I defer you to the ingredient list. If you see hemp seed oil, hemp seeds, while from the hemp plant, when they turn into a plant, have a tremendous amount of CBD in them. The seeds themselves have less than 50 parts per million. So it's a great nutrient. It's great for moisturizing the skin and all of that, but it has really zero benefit from a CBD effect, from a therapeutic benefit. So really looking at that, yes, what you would see on there. And so if you've taken CBD, especially in the MS world, and you're like, well, this stuff doesn't work, I still have pain. Again, we'll get into that. That's why THC is so important.
Okay. And so let's talk a little more specifically about MS symptoms. Dr. Rosenthal, can you speak to the issue of CBD and symptom management? Particularly, what's the role of cannabis therapy in the management of MS-related spasticity?
Absolutely, thank you. So spasticity is one of the more prominent symptoms that has been looked at as it relates to cannabis and multiple sclerosis, and rightfully so. Multiple sclerosis, spasticity is so common in MS patients. The vast majority of MS patients do experience some degree of spasticity, and it can vary by a lot. So the spasticity can be anywhere from mild and not really causing much in the way of functional impairment, or it can be debilitating. It can present as more of a persistent resistance to movement, or it can present as involuntary jerks or spasms. And it can also affect different body parts. The legs are commonly affected, but it can also affect the arms, the back, the neck muscles. And so, as providers, we focus a lot on management of spasticity. And a lot of it is because of the quality of life issues that are connected to it. There are a lot of downstream effects when you look at MS-related spasticity. So, for example, we know that spasticity tends to be more pronounced at night for a lot of people. So, if your sleep is impaired because of your spasticity, now we've also impacted your daytime fatigue, potentially even your cognitive functioning, memory, for example. Another example of how spasticity can affect quality of life really is by, leading to a lot of pain or discomfort. When that occurs, that can reach a point where it can prevent someone from really being able to carry out day-to-day activities that they would otherwise be able to do, and in particular, just normal activities of daily living. And also mobility. So when spasticity is pronounced, it can really affect walking. It can make it difficult. It can cause an individual to have to use a lot more energy just trying to get from point A to point B. And so really the goal in general with our spasticity medication is to reduce the muscle tone, but not to the point that you're left so weak or unable to utilize your strength effectively. We want to accomplish all of that while trying to minimize side effects. Excess sedation in particular can be a barrier to treatment. And so when we're looking at cannabis in particular, for the treatment of the symptom, there really is a growing body of literature to suggest that it can be an effective treatment for spasticity. And so we are absolutely interested in that because it has huge implications for our patients as we manage their symptoms, quality of life as well. I just wanted to just review a couple scenarios and how I view it in my clinic. One scenario may be a patient who is currently on what we consider now to be kind of a standard anti-spasticity medication, or maybe multiple medications, but it's just not cutting it. The spasticity is still pronounced. It's impacting their day-to-day functioning. In that case, it's very reasonable to consider adding on cannabis as a therapy in order to gain the wanted outcome in order to improve quality of life. And another scenario that we may see is somebody who just can't tolerate these medications to begin with because of unpleasant side effects. And in that case, it could potentially be used as a monotherapy, used by itself to try to alleviate some of the symptoms. And it's not to say that cannabis products don't have side effects either, but again, it's you can't treat everybody the same. Especially when looking at symptomatic treatments, it's a very individualized process. And so just trying to find the right combination of medications for our patients, and looking at cannabis really allows us to have additional options.
And I understand that you've been involved in a research project and have a poster presentation. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So just as a little bit of a background, you talk about previous literature looking at the effects of cannabis in symptomatic treatments. Again, I've already spoken about spasticity, but there's also been folks looking at pain, mobility, neuropathic pain in particular. Also looking, obviously You know, one of the downsides sometimes to having a lot of different symptoms is that one can be overwhelmed with a lot of medications that come with their own side effects just from being on medicines. A lot of medications that we use for the treatment of MS are active in the central nervous system and can cause sedation. And so another potential benefit that's been examined in general is looking at, you know, whether or not we can simplify medication regimens by introducing cannabis. And in this particular project that we worked on, we really looked at, you know, spasticity, pain, and these sorts of things to try to see whether or not we were able to, one, make an improvement in their symptoms, but also reduce medications. And there were favorable outcomes. You know, a lot of symptoms were improved. Our project, as well as a lot of other projects, the information becomes more meaningful and it becomes stronger the more, the longer you're able to carry out a project and the more folks that are able to participate in that project. So it is an ongoing project, and I anticipate that we will continue to see favorable outcomes.
All right, thank you very much for sharing that. Now let's talk for a minute to Kristine. Kristine, what have you learned from your involvement in this project?
Hi, thanks for having me. So I do live with MS, and I was really excited to participate in this because I am involved in advocacy, and I did testify for our low THC oil bill here in Georgia. So I have great interest in, you know, this area. So I think as a community, the MS, you know, community, we talk to each other, and we all understand, those of us, you know, who use CBD, THC oils and other products, we understand the benefits that they have to us. But as I was looking into different research articles, as Dr. Rosenthal mentioned, the one word that kept coming up a lot was the word anecdotal, which means what I just said. We tell each other things that help us. We tell our doctors things that help us, but there is not like hard evidence or research or scientific data to support. So the study that we did and wrote up and submitted to be published and presented is just one of many that need to be done to continue to prove out our scientific and medical hypotheses in this area. I really believe this is how we'll continue to remove the stigma of using medical cannabis and start to affect change with things like education, which is what Aryn works really hard to do with Canna Causes, and education, not just with patients, but care providers, our lawmakers, and really the entire community at large. So our end goal really being looking at medical cannabis as another symptom management tool for patients, as Dr. Rosenthal said, just like other meds and therapies, and then providing this data from studies like this so we can propel our appropriate legislation to support care providers and patients. So we have every tool at our disposal to manage MS and other people, to manage other illnesses as well. There's a lot of information and studies being done around Parkinson's, ALS here in Georgia. You can get your medical cannabis card to get oil for, I think it's 17 different conditions or ailments now. So it's not just our community.
Thank you very much. That's an important point. Aryn, let's go to you. So thinking about what Kristine said, it sounds like so many different conditions, so many people with different symptomology, even within the MS community. It seems like dosing must be a bit of a complicated subject. How important is that? And what's the importance of having someone to guide you through cannabis therapy treatments?
Yes. Well, just like with anything, even when the doctors prescribe you a dose of something, they're looking at what they believe would be the most effective based on the results and what they've seen in other patients, and they've been working with you on the things that you've been that have worked and maybe haven't worked. And then if something doesn't work, you increase the dose, right? Or if it's too strong, you might change the cocktail or the medication to a different medication. So it's no different with cannabis. And so the problem out in the industry is, and especially in your world, is when we're really sick, even when I had my cancer, where do I get information that I can trust and that somebody isn't just trying to sell me something or throws a big scare out into the world, that just overwhelms us because we're already kind of at ends with, because we're just sick and tired of being sick and tired. So it's about just finding that right dose, and it comes from what we call the process, 3 steps. You gotta first figure out what works and what doesn't. And so we'll do low, start low, go slow, but don't be afraid to go all the way. And if something isn't, you keep building and increasing your dosages, because again, we're all different. One size does not fit all. And so we do this in a process, and we're trying to find that sweet spot. And just having someone that you can turn to and ask questions, that is, I think, the biggest problem in the space, is that you can go into pretty much almost any 7-Eleven at this point, or a gas station, and get a bottle of CBD. But then what do you do when it doesn't work? And it's difficult. So if somebody called me on that, I wouldn't be able to pass any judgment or answer any questions, because I don't know the product. I don't know what's in it. I don't know if it's been tested. And these are all things that you want to know about when you're looking for searching out someone that you can speak to about what you're trying to do with the dosing. Equally important are ratios and potency. So if I can just speak to potency for a second. Potency is really important. If you think of it like alcohol, wine has an alcohol content of, 40, 50 proof, 80 proof maybe. I don't know, I don't drink a lot of wine, so I don't know, but you can go to grain alcohol at 190 proof. So the way that you get, some people I know, actually I have a business associate of mine that I can sip a glass of wine and she actually gets drunk. So it's one of those things, right? Her tolerance level is just super, super low. And other people maybe have that higher tolerance. So that's number one with potency. The other thing is the modality that we use to uptake it. Smoking it versus drops under the tongue versus eating something or a topical application, different time frames that it takes effect. And you may get a different result by the way that you apply it. Potency is a really big factor. And again, what we do is we try to scale. Start low, go slow, and don't be afraid to go higher. The third thing are ratios, and kind of what I was speaking to earlier when Dr. Thrower mentioned about the CBD you can buy in the market. When you get a bottle of oil, what you're looking for on the bottle are, what is the potency? How many milligrams per ounce? So if it's a 30 ml bottle or a 1 ounce bottle, it will tell you 1,000 milligrams. Well, there's 1,000 total milligrams of these cannabinoids in that bottle. The other thing you look at is the ratio. And what's really important for any of you that are taking notes, in the ratio, the first number is always CBD, the second number is always THC. And this applies industry-wide with the exception of New York. And why they changed it, I don't know, but I went to a medical conference and they do it in reverse. So when you hear the two numbers, like a 24-to-1, 24 parts CBD, 1 part THC. When you start looking at things like vape pens or flour or edibles, and those could be a 1-to-20. So they're very high in THC. And when you see ratios that are 1-to-1, that means they have equal parts. So again, if something's 250 milligram 1-to-1, it has both in equal parts, roughly equal parts. They're not going to be super identical because it's very difficult to get it to match 250 milligrams to 250 milligrams in a 500 milligram tincture. But the idea is that the other products that have the THC, if I have 1,000 milligrams, I know I've got that same 1-to-1, but it's much higher. It's 5 times the ratio, 5 times the parts between a 250 milligram and 1,000. So again, I implore you to look at starting low, because more isn't always more or best. Sometimes the lower potencies and ratios can give you the benefit. And the last thing I would add to that is that the first question you should ask yourself is, why am I using this? Is it for inflammation? Do I have arthritis? Is it spasticity? Is it fibromyalgia? Is it migraines? So some of these things are where the CB1 receptor, and as Dr. Thrower referred to earlier, how that CB1 receptor, the THC, binds to this receptor and helps with the pain management. So maybe I need a little more THC than CBD. So it all depends on the symptoms that you're working with, and in terms of the ratio that you would want to use. So it's not a cookie cutter, cut and dry. And again, all the more reason that you need to seek out somebody that can help guide you in that, and doctors like Dr. Rosenthal and Dr. Thrower. You're on mute.
Yep, my dog started barking and I muted myself and then forgot. Okay, so before we move on to more of the questions that were submitted, I just want to ask whether any of our other panelists had any thoughts that they wanted to share.
I would probably just throw in, when we think about any kind of treatment, we always have to look at it. So we've talked about some of the good. We have to think about any potential side effects that we could see. And it's an area with the cannabinoids that's still under investigation. One of the things that we are seeing pop up around the country as states have legalized some form of medical cannabinoids is something called a hyperemesis syndrome. And so this is, normally we think of cannabinoids as having anti-nausea effect. And that's generally true, but there is this paradoxical effect that we see occasionally where people can actually get intractable nausea and vomiting and end up in the emergency room. This is usually thought of in people that are using higher amounts and daily amounts of cannabinoids, but there have been some cases too where it's just a one-time use. And like Aryn was saying, in someone who maybe is just sensitive and maybe we pushed a little bit too hard, it goes away. The treatment is usually just hydration and it out, but it is something we need to be aware of. There's been some interest in cognitive side effects with cannabinoids, and so when you think about people using cannabis recreationally, they're doing it to try to get a little bit of a euphoric feeling, a high. People know that sometimes you get altered sense of time, and that you can see with cannabis use. There have been some studies that have looked at people with MS who are using daily amount of smoked cannabis. There was a study that came out just earlier this year that in the high daily use of smoked cannabis, showing that if they did cognitive testing in these individuals while they were still using it, they took half of the individuals and let them keep using cannabis for symptom management. The other half went off completely. They repeated their cognitive testing in both groups after 2 months. And the group that went off did get better on their cognitive testing. So it's just something it's not to say that it should be a deterrent. It's just something we have to be aware of. For Dr. Rosenthal and I, we know when we put people on baclofen or Xanaflex, tizanidine, we see sedation, we see cognitive side effects with those medications also. So again, it's not a deal breaker, it's just something we have to watch. And then I would just say, lastly, we're really just starting to understand how cannabinoids might affect the metabolism of other medications. So we always want to be aware of that these are active chemicals. We're using them as medications, and we just have to be aware that they could interact with other medications.
All right, thank you for that. All right.
Can I chime a little bit on there?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that we talk about starting low and going slow, is to avoid those types of problems. And also you'll find that, like, when you take cannabis, what happens to a lot of people For a lot of us folks that are a little bit older, like when we were in college, you know, we had a good time and maybe we did an edible and we took this edible and it's like, holy cow, stop it. I don't like this feeling, like stop the ride. And it goes on for hours and hours and hours. And those reasons are because we took something too much, too fast. And we just had this really bad experience. And like Ben said, it wears off. And you can overdose on cannabis. That is it. You have a panic attack. You think your heart's going to stop beating. Your mind won't stop racing and all these different things that go on. And you think that you're going to die. But the fact of the matter is that there is not one documented case of somebody who took cannabis, that's all they were doing, and died from it. Whereas opiates, and doctors, please correct me if I'm wrong, where the opiates bind to the receptors that control our respiratory system, it basically shuts that down. And these receptors in the endocannabinoid system have nothing to do with our respiratory system. Again, if you just can last it out, that's what you would want to do. But if you just go slow and ease into it, you'll find some of these areas where you're more comfortable. And the last thing I would add there is that when you talk about THC and people say, well, I don't want to get high. So if you take high levels of CBD with THC, it actually helps neutralize in most people the psychotropic effect of the THC. So you can take higher levels of the THC with that. And in a lot of people, it helps kind of neutralize that where you're not getting so high. If you took the same amount of THC just by itself, you probably would be a bit loopy from that. But again, everyone's different, and that's why you got to kind of go through the process and find what works and what doesn't.
You know, a great example of what you're saying, Aryn, is, you know, the real world, before there was more availability of medical cannabinoids, we used to try treating spasticity in MS with Marinol or dronabinol, which is an FDA-approved synthetic THC, and it is nothing but a pure synthetic, no CBD component. And a lot of our patients would come back and say, I don't care for this. It makes me feel loopy and high, and it's not, I'm not functional when I'm on this.
And so the goal is not to get high, but to treat the symptoms. So let's look at some of the questions pertaining to symptoms. We have a question that says, what symptoms can cannabis treat, and which of these symptoms have scientific evidence as opposed to anecdotal evidence?
Doctors.
So there's certainly scientific evidence at this point that lends towards spasticity, being able to be, you know, controlled effectively in some individuals with MS who use cannabis. And I just, you know, it's a lot of the symptoms, I kind of tried to highlight this earlier, they overlap so much. And so it is difficult at times to really separate them adequately when you talk about scientific studies. And the best ways to measure and the best studies are going to be our controlled studies. It's the best way to measure the effectiveness of a treatment, the best way to help really characterize the benefits and help identify which patients are most likely to respond to a treatment. But just, you know, I think all that Aryn was just describing really highlights some of the barriers that we see in our scientific studies, because when you look at, you know, cannabis, it's really a highly individualized process in terms of really getting the maximal outcome. And when you look at controlled studies, that's just what they are. They're very controlled. Everyone's getting the same treatment. And so it does, you know, it's important for patients and providers alike to keep that in mind when you're interpreting these studies. But just going back to the original question, yes. So looking at spasticity is definitely, in my opinion, is pretty well evidence-based at this point. The literature going towards, you know, pain, neuropathic pain, mobility, you know, urinary urgency is not quite as strong, in my opinion. But again, the body literature is growing, and we are developing more, again, of these controlled studies that we need in order to find meaningful results.
And how about the treatment of pain? One of our One of our participants says, I am allergic to most opiates and most pain medications. Would cannabis help me?
I would say certainly worth a try. So, with MS, we see a lot of different types of pain. We see pain from spasticity and spasms. We see central neuropathic pain that Dr. Rosenthal was referring to. So this kind of burning hypersensitivity. I think, going back to what Aryn was saying, is so individual that my experience has been that the tolerability for cannabinoids is generally better than what I see the tolerability for with some of our prescription drugs. Again, that's very individual, but I would certainly say just because a person has had a poor experience or allergic reactions with an opioid or something else that we typically use for pain, I certainly wouldn't let that be a barrier to trying out a cannabinoid.
Now we
if I
go ahead.
If I may, as a patient and somebody that has worked with Dr. Thrower as my physician and Aryn on a consulting basis for using CBD THC oil, I can speak to my personal experience and my symptoms. Again, like everyone said, it's very personal, but so my pain and spasticity has been much improved. I've been able to reduce some of my symptom management medications as a result of adding the medical cannabis to my regimen. So I don't have to take as much baclofen. Some days I don't have to take any. It depends on the weather, so to speak, the heat in Atlanta or the cold. Gabapentin, I actually stopped taking gabapentin quite a while ago. But again, it's very individually based, but each of us is our own kind of resident expert in our MS. We know ourselves very well. And the other thing I would add is, and I'll try to say this as clearly as I can, it just got me thinking about dosing and how individualized that is and the different ratios and all. And I was thinking about all the people I know that have MS, and we talk to each other about, well, I take this, I take baclofen, or I take gabapentin, or I take Tegretol, and we all may take the same things, but sometimes somebody may take 3 baclofen 3 times a day. Somebody else may take 1 twice a day. Somebody else, may need. So that symptom management is also individualized as well. So when we say sometimes that's a barrier to research with cannabis for those types of symptoms, I think, well, yeah, but no. Like, I think one of the largest barrier is having the cannabis itself to do the research right now, because there's one research facility, the University of Mississippi right now, that can give cannabis for research. And from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, they haven't been able to produce good quality cannabis for controlled studies. So that's why having somebody like Aryn, who has good product and has people on it for a long period of time collecting good data, is so helpful to the cause.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that perspective. Quick follow-up to that. You mentioned the positive effects that you've had in relieving pain and spasticity and reducing medications. Have you personally experienced any negative side effects from cannabis?
I have not. No, I personally take tincture oil. I don't dabble in, other areas. So I can't really speak to, recreational use or anything like that.
That brings me to another area of our questions. Thank you. So perhaps Aryn or the doctors would like to comment on administration methods. We have a lot of questions from our participants asking, should I be smoking this? Should I be taking a tincture? What should I be using edibles? What is the best method for a person with MS to be dosed with cannabinoids?
So I'll start with what we would like from a medical standpoint, and then let Aryn maybe comment on how we best achieve that. So ideally, it really depends on what you're trying to do. So if you have chronic, everyday central neuropathic pain or spasticity, ideally what we would like is a medication that maybe gets into your system slowly and sticks around for a while so that you don't have to redose with it as often. And probably to do that, you're going to want to maybe look at something that is an oral or a sublingual form. If you're in 10/10 miserable pain right now and you need something that's going to work more quickly, you would probably want something that's going to give you a higher level of THC, CBD in the central nervous system. So in that may be more of a call for a smoked form. So there are studies looking at how these are absorbed. When cannabinoid is smoked or inhaled, you do get higher peak plasma concentrations and higher levels in the central nervous system go away more quickly also, whereas with an oral or edible or sublingual form, they're going to get in more slowly. You don't get as high of a level, but it's also going to stick around longer.
That's a great point. Dr. Rosenthal, would you like to comment?
No, I definitely agree. That's kind of right on line with what we do just in general with the medications that we use in order to keep things steady and try to minimize just the overall peaks and valleys there.
Right. So I will just add that because we've worked in all the areas with all the different products, so when you look at, as Dr. Thrower said, if I smoke something, if I'm in pain, and I tell people if it comes out of left field or it's chronic 24/7, need immediate relief, then smoking is the way to go. I don't advocate anymore really for smoking the flower because anything that's combustible has carcinogens. So that in and of itself is not good. There's still not enough research done on vaping, but you're vaporizing the oil so you're not inhaling the carcinogens or the butane or whatever else is attached to burning something. The benefit though in vaping is that, again, it's immediate relief, but it doesn't last a long time. So what we'll do is we'll say, well, then do a puff, not a toke or 2 or 3 tokes, do a puff, hold it for a few seconds, and then wait 10 minutes. Because cannabis also has the ability to come up on people, kind of creeps up on you, if you will. So you'll get a little bit higher and a little bit higher, again, to the point where I take a puff or I've eaten an edible and I don't feel anything with an edible, and an hour later I still don't feel anything because it takes sometimes 2 hours to take an effect. I eat more, and then the next thing you know, it's like, ooh, I'm way over my head and I'm not liking this. So taking a little bit maybe of some smoke, if that's the vaping, if that's what is a benefit to you, and it's not a problem. A lot of people don't want to inhale anything, period. And then maybe do some sublingual drops. So by the time that they kick in, the vaping has kind of leveled itself off, and now I'm getting that longevity. And with edibles, as you said, it seems that the longer that it takes to take an effect. So sublingual drops, most people seem to have a result or feel a little bit different. It's not like a light bulb goes on and goes, bingo, it's gone. You just are kind of sitting there thinking, God, how long my pain stopped? Like, I don't even know when it was. But when I go to eat something, the longer that it takes, so 15 to 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes for sublingual drops, most people will have some form of a result. If it doesn't, it may be that you didn't take enough, again, where potency, ratios, and dosing come into play. And then when I eat something, it then goes through my natural filtration system. So my liver, my kidney, my stomach, what I ate, it has to process through that. So you're not getting the full, what's called, the bioavailability of whatever it is that you took. But it will last much longer when you take it in those forms. One other thing I would like to add to that is that again, depending on what we're talking about, if you have Crohn's or some kind of a GI issue or something like that, we might recommend eating it or drinking it to do that. We also do suppository methods for people that have different types of cancer. We might do both sublingual and suppositories recommendations, depending on the disease and the things that we're working with. You know, lung cancer is different than prostate cancer and these types of things. So you got to really just break it down to that, what it is you're trying, what the problem is, and what you're trying to do to solve it.
Okay. Many of our questions were relating to access. So let's talk about access for a few minutes. One of the questions that seems to be repeated is, how do I talk to my doctor about cannabis therapy? Any thoughts?
So as the older doctor here, I will say, when my wife and I were in medical school in the 1980s, there was no information presented to us on cannabinoids or the endocannabinoid system. What's a little alarming to me, and Dr. Rosenthal may speak to kind of what her training looked like. We work with medical students right now. The student that I have working with me right now, I asked him, are you getting training on the endocannabinoid system? And he said no. He's a third-year medical student. So that's a little alarming and kind of sad. So it's hard to have a discussion with your doctor if the doctor doesn't really know what you're asking about. So I think that could be a barrier. I think people are going to find there are different comfort levels also amongst healthcare providers in terms of what biases they come at this subject with. So, and unfortunately, just like there are a range of knowledge bases out there amongst healthcare providers with MS in general, I think people with MS are going to find there's a range of knowledge and biases against, for or against the use of cannabinoids. So hopefully, as we do a better job on our end of educating our colleagues and pushing medical schools to include this in their curriculum, we're going to see those, those comfort levels and knowledge bases improve.
And I would say another barrier, unfortunately, is not so much on an individual level with the individual provider, but sometimes it's facility based. I've worked in military treatment facilities and for the Veterans Administration, and unfortunately, we just have our hands tied in terms of discussing that with our patients. And so in those situations, as a patient, you really, at that point, it's unfortunate, it's difficult, but you oftentimes have to seek a provider elsewhere who is willing and able to discuss using those therapies with you.
I would also add in that is that so I've been invited to speak at I work with a lot of different physicians, and so I've just spoken to some of those things with physicians that maybe didn't have the experience or didn't get it in their training. But there's also, depending on who their employer is and whether the employer actually will support it, they may be in favor of it, but they can't speak to that because of whatever the reasons. It could be because out here in California, Kaiser Permanente, a big hospital group, physicians there that maybe agreed with what it was but couldn't speak to it because maybe they were afraid of donors that wouldn't come in or whatever the reason might be. And so their hands are kind of tied in that regard. So that definitely has to be had, but there are physician groups popping up. I've attended several conferences in the past couple of years. I really like going to those with the physicians, and it's interesting to see the different levels of what some people know and what they don't. And you'll start to find that some of them will just go with, oh, it's a 1-to-1, whatever the potency is, but the ratio is a 1-to-1 for everything. And I don't necessarily agree with that, only because if I could do less, if I'm treating, again, inflammation from arthritis, I don't need a lot of THC. What I need is more CBD with some THC to maybe bring that inflammation down. But at least they're coming around to it, because I've had doctors and pharmacists, I don't have any initials behind my name. And it's by the grace of God that I met Dr. Ben. And we've been working together now for over 3 years with his team and other physicians. And some of these folks will listen. So if your doctor doesn't want to listen, just respectfully, just tell them thank you very much, and you'll find other sources out there. Just you can reach out to us. I can't refer you to a physician. I mean, I would refer you to Dr. Werner, Dr. Jacqueline. Yeah, you'll find it, but just don't be discouraged by that either, because it depends on what their motives are, why they don't want to speak into it.
So I speak with a lot of patients, and newly diagnosed patients, and recently I was talking to a woman who was recently diagnosed and is interested in my experiences in this area. And her MS specialist told her, no, it's too soon. Let's try other things first. She lives in New Jersey. And I've spoken with lots of other patients. While they live in states that may support it with their legislation, there are still physicians who don't, for the reasons that, you know, everybody has just stated. It is a hard conversation. It was one I never thought that I was going to have in my lifetime, and then getting diagnosed with MS and learning everything that I've learned. And then legislatively speaking, never thought I was even going to speak out about it. But I will say the National MS Society has information on their website about the society's position on it. And we also have partners in MS Care on our website that meet the society standards for that. I can't speak to whether or not they would have more of a positive position on this, you know, than others. But if I can say, if you're not happy with the care you're receiving MS-wise, that may be a good place to start. In states where you do need a physician sign off, I've had some patients, if it's not their neurologist willing to do it, they've talked to their primary care physician, or some people have talked to their GI or their gynecologist. They've just tried different specialists to see if they could get the signature to get their medical card. So.
Okay, thank you for that. And so let's talk about legality. Certainly there are states where this is still not legal. And so one of our participants, Sarah, asks, if you're in that situation, how important is it that you tell your doctor if you are taking it?
Dr. Rosenthal, I'm going to punt that one to you.
So that is, I think, a very, you know, it's something that really needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. A lot of it depends on your comfort level with your provider, and you know, if you know your provider has strong feelings for whatever reason, that's, again, I think the main concern I would have from a medical standpoint would be any implications with regard to treatment that it could have. At the end of the day, that's what's most important. And if, you know, it's something that you're using for treatment, it could potentially, you know, Dr. Thrower was talking earlier about potential interactions and that sort of thing, that would potentially cause problems. Or if they were unaware and modifying other medicines to the point where, you know, if you were dealing with more CNS active medications and potential for side effects, it would be important to bring up. But that's hard to give a straight answer for everybody on that question.
Okay.
Another thing that is important is some of us see not only our neurologists, but also pain medicine doctors. They do obviously test you, at least at your initial visit, depending on what treatment you're getting for drugs, THC being one of them. Some pain clinics will not see you any longer if you do test positive despite your state's laws. So that's something to consider before you just arbitrarily start trying some of these products if you are, you know, under the care of a pain clinic.
I would say in general, my feeling is that most providers are not going to hold that against you or have any sort of negative feelings or, you know, I don't think anything negative would come out of it, even in situations when I wasn't necessarily able to support a person doing it myself. I wanted to know and would welcome that information because at the end of the day, it's still, I'm going to incorporate that into my treatment plan. And I would think a majority of other providers would be like-minded. And I certainly would hope so. But, you know, I would always lean towards being more forthcoming with your provider.
I've also found that some patients that were afraid to take it up with their physicians, or as Kristine was saying, that they're in a pain management program, is they find benefit in some form and then bring it up to them and actually bring the doctor around that just hasn't been open to it for whatever reason. And maybe they've had they've been with this doctor 30 years and the doctor knows that, they're a straight person. They wouldn't give me advice initially, but they could say, hey, I've tried this and I just got to be honest with you. I found some relief and benefits. You should look into this more and those kinds of things. So for the most part, I agree that they're not going to hold it against you if you do it, especially now. A couple, 2 or 3 years ago, it was a much different conversation with physicians and being able to.
And I know many of our panelists have been involved in advocating in the state of Georgia for legalization for medical use. So let me just ask, for those individuals who are in a state where this still has not been legalized, do our panelists have any suggestions on how they can get involved in advocating for change?
So I will jump in and then I'll kick it to Kristine because I know she has a lot of experience in this. What I saw in Georgia is that you need a champion, and you need champions both at the medical end, at the legislative end, and on the ultimately the patient end. So ideally, for us, we had Alan Peake, one of our state legislators, kind of our legislative champion early on. And I think what spoke to him was the pediatric epilepsy population. And so maybe for one legislator, it's going to be MS. For someone else, it's going to be epilepsy. For someone else, it's going to be autism. It may be that they have a family connection to one of those health problems, and that's going to really tug at their heartstrings. So I think you've got to get that legislative champion superhero. I think one of the things we found here in Georgia is the MS community, we were really strong in advocating. The pediatric epilepsy and the autism community, I think Kristine and I joked one time that, if our last legislation had not gone through, the MS community would have been up in arms. The moms of kids with autism and epilepsy, though, would have had pitchfork torches at the state capitol. So, yeah, I think you just need the champions. So for MS, working with your government relations committee at the National MS Society, finding out which legislators are friendly to the cause and just educating them, supporting them, and having that three-pronged approach: legislation, patient end, and the medical end.
Kristine, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, and Dr. Thrower's being modest because he played a very large part in both pieces of our legislation here. So again, we want to thank him. But if anybody wants to get involved in advocacy in their state, particularly around this issue, they can always reach out to me, or if they go to the National MS Society website, they can see the status of medical cannabis legislation in their state and what's going on with it. Each state or region in the U.S. has, like Dr. Thrower said, a government relations advisory committee. I chair the one here in Georgia. We meet monthly and determine our priorities, and then we go to work. We give testimony on important issues like medical cannabis. And the most important thing is to tell your story. you can write letters, you can email and make phone calls and talk to them about why this is important. And like I said earlier, removing the stigma of this is what creates change. And I think the committee that was listening to us in Georgia listened, I mean, to me, they listened to veterans with PTSD, the moms with children who were having seizures, people that had Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, I mean, the whole gamut, cancer, the whole gamut of conditions, and was realizing that we're not just a group of people that want to like wake and bake. I mean, if that was the case, like we wouldn't be there. So we want medicine. And like Aryn's tagline is for the foundation, everyone deserves the medicine that they need. And this is truly medicine, especially for those small children who one of them was actually seizing in the room the entire time the mom was waiting to speak. So this is really truly about health and wellness and symptom management. It is not about getting high. Our law in Georgia states you can have 20 ounces of CBD to THC oil with no more than 5% THC. That is not going to alter your mental state at all. We actually wanted more THC, as Dr. Thrower knows, you tried working on that, but that was not gonna fly. Our state is more modest in their approach, but we feel very fortunate in Georgia to have really anything at all pass. So advocacy, just telling your story, I can't emphasize that enough. The lawmakers and legislators do listen. I've had a lot of them say, look, I can't be an expert on every issue. That's why we rely on you, the constituents, to educate us. And they want to hear from us. They don't want to, they have to hear from the paid lobbyists, but they'd much rather hear from everyday people with real stories about how issues affect us. So when they go to vote, they can think about that and make a really good, educated, informed decision.
Kristine, how again would you recommend that people get in touch with your advocacy group or with their legislators?
So with the National MS Society, you can, there is a tab on nationalmssociety.org. There's a tab that says get involved and advocate for change. And that is where you can find all the information about becoming an MS activist. And here in Georgia, people can just reach out to me and I can get them with the appropriate person. Her name's Heather Breeden for the society.
Thank you so much for that. Jump in.
Please. So for anyone on the call that maybe is not from Georgia and is looking at getting involved in your state or whatever, there's a group called NORML, N-O-R-M-L, and it's a legal advocacy group. So I would say look into that in your state, become a part of that. I was also a member of the National Cannabis Industry Association. It's NCIA. I've been to Washington, D.C. twice, and once in 2015 and one in 2016. And we advocated, went on Capitol Hill and did our lobbying effect. But it wasn't about legalizing cannabis. It's about recognizing states' rights. And so what we're trying to do, again, you got to think about that, right? Is like everyone's saying, it's about the medicine. And it's not about, I mean, recreation comes along in some states like California and Colorado, but it's really the medicine that gets us across. So I would recommend looking at those two, NCIA and NORML, for your local area if you don't have any other programs or if you're not in Georgia.
Okay, so those are great resources for finding out more about getting involved in advocacy. Let's talk a little bit more about research. We had a question in the chat from Tony. Where can I find more information on the studies taking place?
So one of the, if people are really into looking at studies that have been published in any peer-reviewed journal, I referred folks to the PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D website. This is the database for over 20,000 peer-reviewed scientific journals around the world. So you can go on there and just type in multiple sclerosis / cannabis, and anything that's been published will come up on that site. If you're looking for trials that are ongoing, clinicaltrials.gov is the site that will kind of point you towards what studies are ongoing or are recruiting in your area. As Dr. Jackie was saying earlier, one of the challenges that we have with THC research is because THC is still listed as a Schedule I compound, to do research with that, you have to get a special DEA waiver. We're in the process of getting one right now through Shepherd, and it's a multiple month process to do that. So there are still some barriers out there. Under the Obama administration, there was serious consideration given to taking THC off of the Schedule I registry with the DEA, and they came really close, but unfortunately they didn't do it. That is something that I think that all of us will be advocating for at the federal level to make research easier.
And what is I'm sorry, was there another thought on that?
Well, I just wanted to kind of speak into a comment that Kristine made earlier about the University of Mississippi being the only one for the last 30 years providing cannabis to researchers in that. And it's the type of cannabis that they get to do the research that's really higher in THC, and just the quality that comes from there has been, well, let's just say not up to par. So that was really big for any studies moving forward. And Israel is a country that's far and away, I mean, that's where the founder of CBD came from. So like Ben said about the list, the PubMed list, look for studies around the world, not just in America, because there's people that are much further ahead of us in study and trial work outside of the country. So good resource.
All right, thank you for that. And so let's just, in these last few minutes, take a little time to sum up. Perhaps our doctors can speak to this question as clearly as you can. What can cannabinoids do for you, and what can they not do for you?
I would say that cannabinoids can have the potential to improve MS-related symptoms, to improve quality of life and day-to-day functioning. At this point, as Dr. Thrower was talking about earlier in the endocannabinoid system and the potential relation to it having, its anti-inflammatory properties, it's very much theoretical assessment at this point. I would say that it cannot provide replace your disease-modifying therapy at this time. There's no evidence for that.
All right, thank you. Dr. Ben, anything to add?
That perfectly sums it up.
All right. And Aryn, here's a question for you. What should people be looking for in a provider for cannabis therapy?
So, you want to be looking for a person and what are their motives for being in this space in the first place. There are a lot of people that are in this space that are farmer type of mentality. They have products and stuff. They're good. They produce, some good products and stuff. But when I say about what are their purpose of being in this space is like, are they testing? Are they doing the research? Are they working with physicians? And whether they're collecting data or not, I mean, having a story is one thing, but it doesn't kind of get you across the line with, especially in the medical community, being peer reviewed and published is like a huge, huge accomplishment. Not for the doctors here. I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you. So what you want to look for is, just that, the integrity of who the group is, and do some research. Can't tell you how many people that come on from us that referred from physicians. And then I ask them, so do you know anything about our backstory? Have you been to our website? You know, oh no, well, my doctor told me. And I always tell them, even when Dr. Thrower refers a patient, listen, I know you trust Dr. Thrower, whatever he tells you, but just do your due diligence. You should always trust but verify. So I can't say that enough and stress that enough, to dig down a little bit and make sure that what people will say, they can back up. You're on mute, Kasey. Kasey, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. Dog was barking again. These are the challenges of working from home.
It's all good.
All right. And Kristine, how has being involved in this advocacy affected you personally, and what has it meant for you personally?
Oh, that's a great question. So I was diagnosed 8 years ago by Dr. Thrower. My life looked very different than it does now. I stopped work in 2015, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do after that. My identity was really wrapped up in my career. And this is my third legislative session that I got involved in advocacy, and it was kind of by accident, so to speak. I received an email from the society asking if who has a story about step therapy or fail first therapy, which probably, unfortunately, many people on the call have been through. I quickly will say it's when your doctor says, I want you to try XYZ DMT, and your insurance says, no, you have to try and fail this one and this one before you can have the one your doctor wants you to have. I had just happened to have just had that experience, and I responded, and the first thing I did was wind up giving testimony about step therapy, and here I am 3 sessions later and testifying on 3 different issues, pharmaceutical benefit manager issues, and I've been to Washington, D.C. twice to our public policy conference talking about federal issues for the MS community. What it's done for me is, in my career, I was a people person, organizational change, and a people manager, and I really feel like I want to make sure that the MS community voice is heard, and represent everybody in the space. Our families, our care providers, patients, everyone that's affected. We now know there's over 1 million people in the United States living with MS, and times however many that are connected to them. So it really affects all of us. And so I think about that every time, I get involved to advocate for legislation that affects us, whether it's medication pricing, medical cannabis, because these things really, when they come down to it, surprise billing, I mean, these things don't discriminate.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much. Well, we're just about out of time, so I would like to take a moment to let everyone know if you missed any part of this presentation, it has been recorded and it will be aired on the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation's YouTube channel, and all of our partnering organizations will be providing that link for you when it's available. And I want to say thank you to our sponsors, CBD Essentials and Big Wave Enterprises, to Canna Causes and Shepherd Center, to the MS Views and News and my organization, the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation, for giving us this opportunity to discuss these important things with you, but especially to Dr. Ben Thrower, Dr. Jacqueline Rosenthal, Kristine Werner, and Aryn Sieber for taking time out of their schedules to share their expertise and their experiences. And thank you all for the hard work you've done in advocacy and research to make this an option for people with MS. We really appreciate you.
Kasey, can I just add one thing there? For all the questions that were asked, thank you very much. And the intent is to answer all of those questions. So for all of you at registration that answered the questions, we're going to go through and answer them and get back to you. So everybody that's on that list will get a response. And then the conversation can be carried on from there as to how that works. So don't think that your questions, if they did not get answered here, that they won't get answered.
Right. Yeah, we couldn't get to all your questions this evening, but they all will be answered. So watch the email that you registered with to receive an answer to your question in writing. And thank you for so graciously agreeing to do that, panelists. Any final thoughts before we close?
Thank you, Kasey, for being such an awesome moderator and helping us wrangle the technology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And everyone deserves the medicine they need. Remember that.
Amen to that.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again to our panelists and to all you participants for being with us. And to everyone, have a good night and stay safe. We hope we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kasey.